Welcome to Twin Talk Politics. Hi everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Twin Talk Politics. And today we are so honored to be joined by Professor Wendy Schiller, Alison S. Ressler Professor of Political Science, and previously Director of the Taubman Center for American Politics and Policy, a role that she is pausing as she takes her sabbatical this year. And if she looks familiar, it's because you've seen her all across your news feeds countless times on MSNBC, NPR, CNN, Bloomberg News, among countless others, and she is undoubtedly one of the leading voices in American politics today, and it comes with no shock that we are immensely excited to speak with you today.
I'm very happy to be here.
As I said previously, we actually have a tradition on our podcast where the first question for all of our guests is just a question of dumb luck. So if it's not evident by our very similar looks or the podcast name itself, Twin Talk Politics, we're twins, unfortunately. So we were wondering if you could take that 50-50 guess at who do you think is Jason and who do you think is Jerry, just based on our different colored backgrounds.
I think you're Jason and the person with the yellow is Jerry.
Oh, unfortunately, that's wrong. I'm Jason and that's Jerry. I'm slightly chubbier, if that's a good indicator for how to tell us apart. And I'm more handsome. Okay, that's debatable. Well, great. Now that you know how to tell us apart, let's dive straight in the interview. I think Jerry made this pretty clear, but we're really inspired by a lot of the incredible work you've done. But for the listeners at home who might not be as familiar, we were just wondering if you could give us a quick introduction of who you are and how you got interested in political science in the first place.
All right, I'll try to make this quick. I was always interested in politics growing up. High school, I volunteered on campaigns. And in college, I volunteered on campaigns, and I was a political science major. And then I interned in Washington, D.C. on Capitol Hill for my congressman. And then I worked for a man named Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan. If anybody ever takes Amtrak into Manhattan in New York City, they'll go into Moynihan Station. It's named after that senator. So I worked for him, and then I worked for Governor Mario Cuomo, who is the former governor of New York and the father of the current mayoral candidate, Andrew Cuomo. And then I loved politics, and then I wanted to study politics. So I pursued my graduate PhD education at the University of Rochester, not far away from Canada, and I continued to love it. And then I focused on the United States Senate, and I wrote about why senators introduce particular legislation, why they push it, what makes them interested in it, how can we predict which senators will pursue which issues? And then I looked at how senators represent their own states together. There's a very unique system, not very unique as an oxymoron. It is a somewhat rare system where you have two politicians representing the same geographic district. We have that in Latin America in a lot of countries, but we don't have it anywhere else in the United States system. And then I studied history, how senators were elected by legislatures before they were directly elected. And that changed in 1913. And now I work on something quite different, which is the impact of federal public policy and how well federal laws and funding works in the area of women's human security and domestic violence.
Great. Thank you so much for that. And throughout this interview, hopefully we can touch on every single element of what you just talked about. So I guess we'll start with one of your central interests, as you touched on, which is a broader theme of representation, specifically in the Senate, which runs throughout your works. We know you cover so many different intriguing ideas here, but we thought it would be fitting and wanted to start, I guess, with the more historical discussion of the past and then transition throughout the next couple of questions into the present. So, as you said in your work, Electing the Senate, Indirect Democracy, before the 17th Amendment, you dive into how senators were originally chosen by state legislatures through an indirect process that produced things such as frequent deadlocks, vacancies, and opportunities for corruption. However, after the 17th Amendment, direct elections expanded democratic accountability to the citizens themselves, but also introduced things such as expensive statewide campaigns, the nationalization of Senate races, and an ever-increasing sort of lack of trust in government institutions. We have two questions here. So I guess firstly, direct elections have undoubtedly expanded democratic accountability, but do you think there are any meaningful lessons we can still take away from the pre-17th Amendment era? And second, just looking ahead, what reforms do you believe are most important to strengthen the Senate's representative role today?
Well, to the first question, when the Constitution was created and agreed upon and ratified in the United States, to create the United States of America, in the late 1780s. Obviously, 1789 was our first, official Congress, meeting of the Congress. The Senate was supposed to be insulated from direct public opinion, meaning temporal, meaning whatever the public thought on a Monday or a Thursday or any given month of the year. The founders wanted the Senate to be able to say, no, 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 we are here for 6 years. We have to look to the national interest and we have to look longer term. And in order to insulate them from the direct constituent opinion, they basically arranged for state legislatures to select US senators. And they didn't have a process in the Constitution spelled out for that. They just said these elections shall happen in state legislatures. So state legislatures didn't meet all that often. They had very different rules for quorums, majority rule, nominations. There was no gatekeeping. There's no real nomination process, really. In state legislatures, anybody could put their name forward, and you needed a majority in both chambers to get through. And it really created a lot of chaos, actually. Most people don't know, between 1789 and 1866, when there was corruption, parties would fight. Sometimes they wouldn't send a senator to Washington because they couldn't agree. So they standardized it with a congressional act to elect US senators that was supposed to make things smoother, but it just made things worse. And as political parties became bigger and stronger and more mass-based, the stakes for who would win a Senate seat became really much more contested, much more valuable. So you had a lot of conflict in the late 19th century, right before 1913, when we get to direct election. And the conflict was really over party prizes, partisanship, polarization, a lot of things we hear today. But so senators were insulated. And state legislators only really served 2 years at a time. They didn't stay the whole 6 years. So, Jerry, if you were elected in time T, and then you went to get reelected in the state legislature 6 years, and a lot of senators sought reelection even back then, you wouldn't have the same audience. You wouldn't have nearly any of the same state legislators. So nobody was holding you accountable, really, except for political party leaders. And that's what sort of started the longtime connection between state political parties and partisanship and US senators, even before direct elections. So the conflict got so big, and there were so many times when we didn't have all of our senators elected, like in the 1900s, Delaware didn't even have any senator for a couple of years. Then states decided to pass the 17th Amendment first, and then the Congress passed it in 1912, and then it was ratified in 1913, and the first official Senate popular elections were held in 1914.
Right. Thank you for that. That's really, really interesting. I guess it's a concept that we've been especially intrigued by in researching your work and hearing your perspective, since Canada still operates within like an indirect system at the Senate level, where the Governor General appoints senators under the advice of the Prime Minister. So your ideas really make for a thought-provoking comparison there. So thank you so much for that. Just transitioning linearly through time, today we see how the Senate functions on what you describe as a dual representation system that, regardless of state size or population, gives voters 2 points of access and accountability since there's two senators. I think, as you pointed out earlier, this is a really unique dynamic since both senators represents the exact same constituency. Yet, as you highlight in your book, Partisan Rivals, dual representation often creates both opportunities and also tensions. So, for instance, as you point out, the senior senators often dominate, influence. Both members compete for credit as well as media time and influence, and split party delegations can often fall into rivalry that oftentimes undermines state priorities instead of advancing them together. So in today's polarized climate, our question is, does a dual representation system still provide voters 2 points of access and accountability, or has it become more about rivalry and rather than collaboration?
I think that's an excellent point. I think senators are human beings like everybody else. So sometimes they'll come in and they'll have run against each other in a prior election. So sometimes there's sort of built-in animosity, whether it's the same party or a split party. Just going back to one thing, governors had to certify Senate elections in the indirect period. So when you think about presidential certification and how we have to have governors certify the presidential elections results in the United States of America, the same thing was true of Senate elections. And sometimes governors would not do it. They would say, no, we're not certifying this. We don't agree with the choice. So there's always been that power to sort of thwart the result of an election. And nowadays, we have fewer split party delegations than we did when I wrote that book. When I
Right.
wrote that book, I think there were 17 split party delegations. I think we're down to 12, maybe 11. So that means that more states are getting totally one party dominated, like California, for example, even though they have nonpartisan elections now, they're fairly dominated by the Democratic Party.
Yeah. Right.
But sometimes senators will get elected, and they're two women, for example, Washington State, also a border state with Canada. And
Yeah.
you'll have two senators, Maria Cantwell and Patty Murray. And Patty Murray got elected first, then Maria Cantwell. And Patty Murray's always been the more famous nationally
Yeah.
senator than Maria Cantwell. But that can give Maria Cantwell some operating room to address things that are really important to Washington State, more local, more specific. And in the Senate, the rules of the Senate mean that senators from the same state, typically and the same party, cannot sit on the same committee. Sometimes it happens, rarely.
Yeah.
But usually the parties say, no, 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 that would be too much influence for one state on a single committee. So senators are actually forced to divide themselves. They have to have separate interests. And they go out and they tell their constituents they're doing things differently. And they're never, not never, it is rare for senators to be elected at the same time from the same state. If somebody
Right.
resigns or passes away and you have to fill a special election seat, that can happen. But generally speaking, it doesn't happen. So they don't face each other directly, but they're always competing for constituent attention, always good press, now with social media, and legislative accomplishments and influence. There's always competition, which is really good for a state. The problem is if you have something that's very specific to your state, let's take Iowa. Iowa is a farm state. We know
Mhm.
that. Most recently, it's turned red consistently. It had Joni Ernst, still does, and Charles Grassley. Charles Grassley's in his early 90s. Senator Grassley, elected in 1980, a long time ago. Joni Ernst got elected and decided not to run for re-election this time around. Iowa seems to be simmering, maybe going a little more purple. They have some Democrats that are polling favorably. This is interesting because the number one issue in Iowa is agriculture, without question. So you ask yourself, does it matter a lot to Iowa to have two Republicans or two Democrats? It matters to the national parties, but to Iowans, each of those senators always has to pay attention to agriculture.
Wow.
So it's
Mhm.
easier when you have two senators from the same party and same state most of the time. But when there's a dominant industry in a state, both senators will always be very careful to pay attention.
Yeah, for sure. I guess that segues pretty nicely into our next question, which we kind of want to talk a little bit more about both the positives and also the ramifications of competition, and also just touching on the idea of polarization as well. We actually got to speak with Professor Patashnik very recently, and we actually now love to hear your perspective on your shared work, dynamics of American democracy, partisan polarization, political competition, and government performance. I guess polarization is one of the biggest plagues right now, with nearly 90% of the American population seeing political polarization as a major threat towards the country. And one fact that really stood out from your book is survey data that showed that 2/3 of voters wanted more alternatives to policy choices that Democrats and Republicans are offering, but they do not necessarily want a third party. And that's really fascinating since competition is often described as a lifeblood of democracy, yet in today's polarized system, it can just as easily reward obstruction and symbolic posturing over genuine policy outcomes. So our question is, how can we draw the line between healthy competition that strengthens democracy and destructive competition that undermines government performance?
Well, it's an excellent question. And in that volume, there's Samara Klar has a piece about social media, and Chris Kanthak has a piece on negative partisanship in particular. And Matt Grossman also has a piece on sort of the way we think of each other as tribes. You know, in the 19th century, a Democrat and a Republican were very far apart. And there was tremendous animosity over obviously Reconstruction, slavery, and also trade politics. And it was basically seen like you were a completely different creature. You had completely different interests. And there was no room in between, no bipartisanship. It was deeply polarized. I think what the differences are is that there's so many more outlets to express that polarization and that division today than there were more than 100 years ago. And there was sense that corporate America kind of kept a lid on it, controlled
Yeah.
things so that government could work. Now, corporate America is not corporate America anymore unified. It used to be that was a sort of very modifying force. Look, we're employing lots of people. We want the economy to be good. Let's not go overboard. And now you have two major different sectors, right? You have social media and the media tech companies, which are really, really powerful and very wealthy. But you also have the manufacturing sector and you have the service sector. And all of our corporations are global. Now, that was not true 100 years ago. And if you are global, you need to be stable. And I think what we've lost in moderating, at least internally in Congress, is this impact that the business sector can have to make sure that we stay stable. And social media is sort of inherently destabilizing.
Yeah.
And the tech companies don't want to be regulated. And so if you are spewing lots of information, by the way, in the 19th century, newspaper owners, William Randolph Hearst is a very famous one, but the New York Times started to be powerful in the late 1900s. Atlanta Journal-Constitution, for example. These newspaper companies, they had very, very big sway over people who could read.
Yeah.
Now, not everybody could read. Today, everybody thinks they're an expert. Everybody distills information by themselves. They don't have a communal source anymore. They just and they don't even talk to other people about what they're thinking. And that creates a more volatile, angrier, more conflictual type of polarization than we had 100 years ago. And the other thing we want to think about, or even more than 150 years ago, one thing we want to think about is that there is an upside to distinct parties. So, for Americans, we have a two-party system. That's a whole nother conversation if you want to talk about the origins of that. And essentially, because we have single-member districts, we're only fighting over one seat, one person at a time, even in Senate races. And so you converge to the middle when that happens most of the time. And so therefore, we usually have two choices. And we've always been a sort of by-choice country. Break with Britain, don't break with Britain. Slavery, no slavery. Get into World War II, don't get into World War II. So all sorts of things have always been a choice. So now we are used to that. So we have Democrats and Republicans, and the difference is the distance between them. It's just as great as it was, but the federal government is so large now and affects everybody's life. So when you have a conflict over whether you should fund education, or a conflict over whether you should allow people to get a tax credit for something, or whether they get health care. Most of the time, people say, well, everybody benefits from that. We should reach a compromise. But all of those kinds of issues that used to push us to the middle are swallowed up in this antipathy that people have towards each other. I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat. The irony is that the greatest percentage of American voters are registered as independents. So you have about 35%, give or take, Republican, 35%, give or take, Democrat registered, and the rest of them are either no affiliation or registered independent voters.
Wow.
So what people say about who they are is different from how they vote. And the argument, like you just went back to, is that they don't have any choices. They say they're independent, but in the end, when they go to vote in most places now, with some exceptions, ranked choice voting is creating a whole different environment.
Yeah.
Is that they can only vote for Republican or Democrat.
Yeah.
So the system squeezes our choices into one or the other, and that just kind of re-solidifies a lot of that division that we have.
Yeah, wow. Thank you so much for that insightful answer, just focusing on why the system itself kind of creates this problem. And just continuing on polarization and jumping back at what you talked a little bit about, which was tech companies and social media, we kind of want to talk a little bit more about that. But before that, we know something very interesting that you've noted in your past lectures is that this idea of polarization isn't something spurred very recently. In fact, it dates all the way back to the beginning of American politics and American history between Jefferson and Hamilton. But as you've stated, it's exacerbated immensely due to the sheer size of voters that parties need to mobilize and often shift towards digital platforms to do so. As you've noted, fragmented media now also rewards politicians with airtime for conflict, partisan attacks, and almost a horse race style of politics, while algorithms on big tech companies, whether it be Twitter, X, Facebook, Instagram, they amplify emotion-driven content, often misinformation or disinformation, that really makes it harder for voters to delineate what's true and what's not. So our question is, how do you see the role of social media shaping polarization today? And can it realistically be redirected towards strengthening democratic accountability?
Yeah, can it be redirected is a really important question. And we will need, in at least the United States, all of our social institutions to think about how much screen time we all use and all
Yeah.
what we have.
Yeah.
And, and on the one hand, schools, for example, across, I think New York City and some other places now are forbidding cell phone use
Wow.
and no cell phones in class. Now, everybody's on a laptop most of the time now.
Right.
So you still have that opportunity, but no cell phones, no, and reducing some screen time. And I think that's very important to encourage human interaction.
Mhm.
It's much easier to demonize other people when you never talk to them and you never see them and you never interact with them and you don't see them as human. And we've seen that throughout human history when people are slaughtered, when there's conflict, genocides, we see that the first steps were to dehumanize people.
Yeah.
And because there's, you can think about schooling, you can think about remote work. You can think about the fact that you don't go into the office maybe to see people and you don't take a public transportation to get to the office, perhaps. So you're losing all these connector points that you used to have with people you don't know, people who may be different from you in any number of ways. And that creates more silence. That creates, and these silos exist as deeply on the left as they do on the right. There isn't really everybody, people can be just as siloed in all ways. And trying, I think we're seeing schools, we're seeing religious organizations, we're seeing sort of a hunger now post-COVID to maybe try to be in the same place and see each other as human. And I think, but to that point, technology and business are pushing us all to do everything through a phone, a
Mhm.
chat bot, chat GPT, artificial intelligence. That's pushing us away from human interaction. And so these two forces, are countering each other. And it's going to take a lot of human capital mobilization. Just people look up. I say to my students when they're walking down the street, they have their headphones on and they're looking at their phone. Look up. I always say you
Right.
might meet somebody. I don't know, your generation maybe doesn't date as much as other generations used to do. And I think I always say to my classes, you might meet somebody. It could be a friend, it could be more, but that you're missing opportunities to connect.
Yeah.
And it's got to be a conscious pushback against sort of the head down approach. And politics won't solve it. Politics won't solve it. Politicians are scared now in America for their safety. That may be the only thing that ramps down the rhetoric. We're going to have a memorial for Charlie Kirk, who was
Mhm.
assassinated this past week in a horrific, horrific crime. And there'll be a big memorial for him. And we're going to watch what the tone of those remarks are, because it's going to be a very important signal to a lot of his followers and a lot of people who may not have agreed with him, but certainly respected him and we thought it was absolutely tragic what happened to him. So when you think about that, how can elite politicians set a different tone? And it's going to be a very big challenge as we move forward.
For sure. And just transitioning on a theme in your work that sort of connects with that is this sort of entrenched mindset of politics, almost like a zero-sum game, where both parties not only blame each other for gridlock that is happening, but when they come into power, they often spend just as much as energy and time and power undoing the policies of the previous administration as advancing their own, as we so often see with the cycles of policy oscillations. And in your work, you show how oftentimes these cycles undermine government performance, weakens public trust, and feeds into that lack of confidence in government institutions. I guess our question here is, given this dynamic, how can voters realistically tell who is accountable for shortcomings within government?
Well, voters, there was an argument made by political scientists in 1950. E. Schachtschneider and V. O. Key are the 20th century's probably two most famous political scientists. They wrote a report in 1950 for the American Political Science Association that really argued quite strongly for two parties, two strong parties, two cohesive parties, and two divided parties. Parties that presented quite starkly different visions of what government should be. And in 1950, we'd had the New Deal under FDR, but we hadn't had the Great Society under Lyndon Johnson. Our government was considerably smaller,
Mhm.
much smaller. So when you think about that, what they argued was Most people are busy educating, raising their children, working, trying to sort of provide a good life for themselves and their families. They don't have time to study policymaking. They don't have time to trace the dollar that they send in taxes to the state government or the federal government back to them. It's very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Parties give you general cues about what that money will be spent on and how government will be involved in your life. When you had Lyndon Johnson layers so much more, and then, we had the prescription drug expansion under Medicare under George Bush, a Republican. Then we have Obamacare under Obama, a Democrat. We have the big Inflation Reduction Act under Biden. So we see all these massive expansions of federal government. It only makes it harder to keep track of government. And when government is that big, a 7.4, almost $8 trillion maybe next year in their budget, and when you have a government that big, it's impossible to figure out what can be done and how to do it well and effectively. It is. I'm studying domestic violence policy, keeping women safe, hundreds of millions of dollars out the door every year, and it's very difficult to show success. So what do you do with that? How do you sell that? Well, now we have very clear lines. Republicans stand for one thing and Democrats stand for the other. Here is the big secret. Since, I would argue, 1980, the federal budget has gone only up, never down. It has risen every year from 1980 to 2025. No matter how many administrations come in and say they're cutting the deficit and they're cutting the budget. Now, Clinton actually got a surplus. George Bush gave the surplus away in a tax cut bill and two big wars. And then we had the stimulus package under Obama. We had COVID under Trump. It just has been impossible to catch up. So people are used to it. But the point is that no matter what the parties say they're going to do, the government apparatus still keeps going. And even though Trump had DOGE in the beginning, we would note for the record that the Trump administration is hired some of those people back, not all, but some. And the Trump administration is hiring more people for Homeland Security and for different priorities. But that government employee payroll isn't going to look much different at the end of this second Trump administration than it did at the end of the Biden administration. So how do we decipher that as an average person? There's no way to do it. So what these Schatzschneider and Vioki said, the best you can hope for is clear party control, clear policy enactment from one party, and free and fair elections. And the thing that I think Americans have to worry most about is preserving regularly scheduled, free and fair, accessible elections, because that is when we can register our verdict. Did we like what Trump did in his second term? We'll have an opportunity to say that in 2026 when we vote for Congress. Do we like the Republicans in the House or the Senate or not? But as long as those elections are preserved, the argument is this is the best you're going to be able to do in a country of hundreds of millions of people with a massive federal government.
Yeah, thank you so much for your answer, and just really focusing on what we can control and preserving our elections as the best means forward. Yeah, I definitely think that's a way to go. Now we kind of want to shift the back end of our conversation here to another aspect of your scholarship and a very deeply troubling problem, which is domestic violence. And we know both the Violence Against Women's Act and the Lautenberg Amendment established federal standards to restrict firearms access in domestic violence cases. Yet state adaptation has often lagged and varied in implementation widely. And one statistic that you've highlighted that really struck out to us was that about 50% of women who lose their lives to domestic violence are killed with a firearm. And even beyond the slow adaptation of the previous mentioned policies, in many states, once a domestic violence restraining order has expired, often just 2 years, the respondent can still regain access to a gun. So our question is, do you see this uneven adaptation and reluctance as a problem of primarily political will, institutional design, or constitutional limits on federal authority?
Well, thank you for mentioning the book Inequality Across State Lines, How Policymakers Have Failed Domestic Violence Victims, came out in 2023. We have a couple of articles that come with it. And our macro point is laws are only as good as they are implemented. And, when you think about gun violence, there's lots of excellent scholars doing a lot of work on gun violence. Our point is that the intersection of more liberal freedom to own a gun, possess a gun, making it harder to take away a gun, makes it more dangerous for people who are already in abusive relationships. And when we wrote the book, that statistic was 50%. And when we published it, so it takes about a year to publish a book, it is 2025. And last year's statistic is that 66% of women who die from domestic violence die by gun. So the question for people who believe in gun rights in America, and we have a long history of gun rights and a long history of gun violence in America. We were founded on it. We've always had it, particular political violence. We have a long history of that as well. The question is, how do we break that connection between abuse, gun, and of course, injury and death to a woman and sometimes children? Oh, the biggest thing is make sure that judges issue orders that say you cannot have a gun. You would be surprised how many times judges don't issue that when they could say to a domestic restraining order, you can't have a gun. Now, the federal law says if you're under a restraining order, you cannot have a gun. But you need to put that in the restraining order. Literally, the judge has to say that in most states in the United States. And then you have to let the abuser know. You have to inform the abuser. And then if you cannot have a gun, the judge can sign a warrant, not a warrant, an order for police to go get the gun. However, it is a very dangerous position to put police in. 25, according to a Georgia Tech study, 25% of all injury and death to police officers are serving domestic violence warrants. In Utah, we just had this circumstance. 2 police officers were killed in an ambush. So this isn't about bad policing. This isn't about taking everyone's guns away. It's implementing and enforcing the law. We had a case, a very tragic case where somebody was murdered in Alabama a week ago. And this is a woman who was on a dog, walking her dog. That person was arrested on a gun charge 2 years earlier in the state of Virginia, and they were let go, and they were not prosecuted. 10 or 15 years ago, if you were caught with a gun, you went to jail. So there's been a real movement now, if you have no priors, because of gun rights, and also because of a reluctance to put people in jail. You know, it's a combination of the mass incarceration movement to de-mass incarcerate, but also more liberal gun laws. You are having people who are dangerous to society who used to be put in jail for some period of time, and then they're not allowed to have a gun if they're a convicted felon when they come out. So you're protecting on the inside and outside, and that person wasn't prosecuted fully, and somebody lost their lives. A woman lost her life. So this is the big problem that we're trying to work on now, is the effectiveness of federal dollars. That's our next iteration of this project. You're spending so much money, and is it working? And that's the puzzle we hope to solve in future work.
Sure. And we wanted to bring this conversation around domestic violence and femicide in the context of our modern age, more so to do with technology. I think there's often a misconception that the digital era has solely and completely made it easier for women in danger to reach out for help. But in reality, abusers frequently exploit things such as technology, controlling social media passwords, tracking locations, or even accessing credit and banking information, which can make reaching out just completely impossible. In fact, we were reading about this the other day, that around 97% of US domestic violence service providers report that survivors have experienced some form of technology-enabled abuse. So our question is, given these dynamics, how do you see technology reshaping the challenges of domestic violence? And in your opinion, what responses or protections are most effective in addressing them?
Well, that's an excellent question. We saw in the pandemic that domestic violence rose, and there were fewer calls to hotlines because the abuser was home with the victim, and there was no opportunity. So now we have to ask the tech companies. We really have to say to the tech companies, and I know they're working on human trafficking quite a bit, and sex trafficking, but I don't see as much work in the domestic violence field. If you send a threatening message on your cell phone to your ex-partner, you should be cut off from your cell phone. The technology company, AT&T or Verizon in America, they should be able to say, T-Mobile, you're done. We're shutting down your phone. You can't use your phone anymore because you have used it as a weapon of cyber terrorism and cyber threats. Now, I'm working with a student at Brown on a paper. We're just beginning our journey to look at all of the state laws across the whole country on cyber terrorism and domestic violence. What are the penalties? What can we do? And how can we make tech companies more responsible for the misuse? You know, if you have a gun and you kill somebody, God forbid, or you injure them, you know, the gun companies don't get sued in America. They're protected from that. But there are ways they can make trigger locks, for example, fingerprinting. They can make it harder to steal a gun and use it illegally, for example. So why can't tech companies make it harder to send abusive language and abusive and threatening messages to a partner? If you're on the same family cell phone plan, you should be able to monitor that if you're a tech company. And this is not free speech. Oliver Wendell Holmes made it very clear in his very famous decision in this Schenck Supreme Court case that you can't shout fire in a crowded theater. You cannot put somebody's life at risk with speech. And this is, I think, the next frontier. And the problem is that the people who are out in front advocating for this are busy taking care of domestic violence victims. We can't do it all. So the purpose of this research is to point these questions out and make them part of the policy sphere dialogue when you're thinking about tech regulation, really thinking about how do we make it much safer for women who are abused. But as you say, if you have the same bank account, they're going to know if you access the bank account. There are all sorts of ways, and as everything goes more digital, you leave a trail. And it's very hard to escape that trail. So these are the kinds of questions, I'm really glad you're asking about them, that we hope, my colleague Caitlin Sidorsky at Ramapo College in New Jersey, and I hope to raise and start to answer. And then we hope a lot of other people follow us and pursue this research.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for all of your amazing answers towards all of our questions. And we kind of wanted to end off the conversation on a more fun question. So we know you said before, if you could have dinner with anyone in history, it would be Queen Elizabeth I. So we are wondering if that was still your answer, and if so, we'd love to hear why.
Well, I would love to know. When I was in fourth grade, third and fourth grade, I started to read all sorts of British history, and I didn't read sort of the really violent British history that was under also Queen Elizabeth's reign, but I thought, what an amazing thing for a woman to take the reins, in the middle of the 16th century and never marry and build an incredibly powerful, not only military, but economic powerhouse. I mean, Britain was still fending off France under her father's reign and her grandfather's reign, and Spain. And by the time James inherits, right at the turn of the 17th century, James I, when he inherits, Britain is a powerhouse. And she built it. And she managed to take advice from men, but follow her own path. And she did execute her enemy, her perceived enemy, Mary Queen of Scots, among other people. But unlike Catherine the Great, for example, a very different kind of story, Queen Elizabeth was a trailblazer and a woman who managed power successfully and built something. And I think today we have examples of women who've been entrepreneurs, built things, been great leaders, controversial, but gotten elected. And I'd like to still see more female governors as a role model. And also, ultimately, I'd like to see, from whatever party you can find, a female president of the United States.
For sure. Wow. Thank you so much for your answer. It's clear you have such a deep history of both American and as well as British history. So thank you so much for that. All right. I think that concludes our interview for today. Again, Jerry and I would like to extend such a big thank you to Professor Schiller for this amazing opportunity and taking the time out of her extremely busy schedule to come here and meet with us and actually take the time out of her day to speak with us. So we truly, truly appreciate it. For all the listeners at home, if you guys wish to see more interviews like this, be sure to tune into future episodes. Thank you, everyone, and we'll see you guys next time.